Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Field. I'm the director of Stanford's Woods Institute for the Environment. And it's great to have you join us today for a webinar on the topic, Can Planting Trees Fix the Climate? The Role of Forestry in the Climate Solutions Portfolio. There are many things we can be doing to address the climate challenge. You might ask, why should we even be discussing those when we're really in a all hands on deck situation with the coronavirus? But at least for me, there's really one message that the coronavirus crisis has brought into focus, and it's the message that unless we're prepared for the future, we can't deal with it effectively. And when we look at climate change, there's nothing more important than effective preparation. So what we're going to do today is have a conversation that involves all of you on the topic of climate solutions, natural climate solutions, and the role of trees and forests. We're going to orchestrate this so that it feels as much like a conversation as possible. We have a number of leading experts on the topic who will be answering questions from me and from all of you as the conversation goes along. Here's the general plan. All of you have access to the Q&A window. If you type in questions, we'll plan on getting to those questions in the second half of the session. If your questions don't get answered, we have the opportunity to follow up in writing later on. Let me say just a few things about where we're coming from. The Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment is a 15-year-old entity, an investment Stanford University has made in providing practical solutions to critical environmental problems, practical solutions for people and the planet. Historically, we've worked in the areas of climate, water, food, health, and oceans, but increasingly all of those focus on the area of adapting to a changing climate, providing solutions to a changing climate. Universities have historically been wonderful at providing kind of abstract ivory tower solutions to problems, but have had difficulty connecting with the economic, financial, political, and cultural constraints that are overwhelmingly important in the real world. And in the Woods Institute, we try to break down the barriers between disciplines and between approaches in order to empower scholars from across the university and across the broader society to really bring solutions into focus and to unravel the opportunities that we have for moving forward. And there's probably no area in which that's clearer than the area of natural climate solutions, where we're building on the historical emphasis on understanding ecosystem processes and connecting it with important, hopefully vibrant solutions to tackling the climate challenge. Let me provide just a little bit of background before we switch to the Q&A part where you'll get the real value. Last year, the emissions of carbon dioxide from industrial activities were on the order of 37 billion tons of CO2, a vast quantity. An additional about 6 billion tons came from cutting down forests. But at the same time, the uptake of CO2 by ecosystems on land was more than 100 billion tons, of which about 98% of that was returned to the atmosphere in decomposition. There are many lines of evidence that we could do a better job stewarding ecosystems, protecting forests, expanding forests where possible in order to draw CO2 from the atmosphere and create an asset that's helping us with the challenge that we must achieve if we're going to stabilize climate change, of bringing CO2 emissions down to zero. One of the most attractive features of the forestry-related activities is they have the potential to create negative emissions, a net transfer of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to long-term storage in ecosystems. And as we look at the opportunities for enhancing our practices with ecosystems, we really have the potential for compelling solutions to the climate challenge. A lot of the questions, however, concern how fast, how much, and when. With that, let me turn to introduction of our outstanding panelists for today, and we'll start the conversation. So first up, we have Anne Bartuska. Anne's a senior advisor at Resources for the Future. She joined RFF in 2017 after serving as the USDA's chief scientist, deputy undersecretary for research, education, and economics. Anne's work focuses on natural resources and forestry, especially natural climate solutions through forests and agricultural lands. Anne's other credits include service on the advisory board of the National Science Foundation, leading the Nature Conservancy's Invasive Species Initiative, and a successful term as president of the Ecological Society of America. Then we'll have Dan Nepsat. Dan's the president and founder of Earth Innovation Institute. He's worked in the Amazon for more than 30 years and in Indonesia for a decade, publishing papers and books on ecological processes, frontier dynamics, and public policies that are shaping these regions. Dan's a leading authority on REDD and low-emission rural development, with accomplishments that span research to grant making to on-the-ground farmer organizing. Dan served as a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Research Center, chief program officer of environmental conservation at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. He co-founded the Amazon Environmental Research Institute in 1995 and Alianza de Terra in 2004. Then we'll go to Rebecca Shaw. Rebecca is the chief scientist and senior vice president at World Wildlife Fund, where she works with staff and partners around the world to identify the most important scientific questions that challenge the WWF mission and advance solutions to those challenges. Rebecca's been researching and leading interdisciplinary approaches to conservation and climate change for more than 30 years. Much of her experience is in the area of responses of ecosystem carbon balance to climate change. Prior to her time at WWF, Rebecca served in key science and leadership roles at the Environmental Defense Fund and the Nature Conservancy. Personally, I had the pleasure of working with both Dan and Rebecca on the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where they were both lead authors. And the final panelist is Rob Jackson. Rob is the Michelle and Kevin Douglas Provostial Professor in the Department of Earth System Science at Stanford, where he's also a senior fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment and the Precourt Institute for Energy. Rob also chairs the Global Carbon Project, which has, under his leadership, become the go-to place for up-to-date information on the global cycles of carbon dioxide and methane. Rob's work ranges from the ecology of forest drought responses to methane leakage from oil and gas infrastructure. His interests range even further. Rob's credits include a book on the environment for general audience, 2 books of children's poems, and published photographs almost everywhere. This year, Rob's a Guggenheim Fellow and sabbatical visitor at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. Let me start with you, Rob, in terms of questions. You've been studying the carbon cycle of forests for a long time, especially effects of drought and fire. At the same time, we're talking about dramatically increasing the stock of carbon in forests and forest soils. We're also looking at a future with increasing impacts of climate change, including drought and wildfire with the potential to lead to large releases of carbon to the atmosphere. How should we be integrating future climate change into our thinking about the potential from forestry?
Well, thanks, Chris, and thank you all for joining us. I like Chris, I'd first like to extend thoughts and prayers for everyone in need, particularly the poor and elderly, and just like for climate change, we will get through this. I want to begin by focusing the many good things that forests do for us today. I mean, they absorb almost 1/3 of global fossil fuel pollution right now. They clean our air, recycle our water, protect soils, and enhance biodiversity. So everything we can do to protect and restore our forests will be a win far beyond climate. Initiatives such as the Bond Challenge can restore hundreds of millions of acres of degraded forest lands around the world. Dan will talk about the critical importance of protecting tropical rainforests. Forests do something something else too. They engage and inspire the public, and we can't forget how important that is. So I'd like to highlight soils also as additional opportunities. Where we can get extra carbon into soils, it's likely to stay there even longer than in trees. It'll make our soils more fertile, better at holding on to water, and protect them against erosion. I mean, so done well, the Trillion Tree Initiative is a fantastic opportunity. Done badly, we can discuss today, the Trillion Tree Initiative could cause more harm than good in some places. So we could replace diverse native forests and grasslands with exotic monoculture plantations. We could reduce stream flow, particularly in temperate boreal systems where convection is less and water recycling is weaker than in the tropics. So you can't get more carbon in most places on the Earth without spending some water to do it. Forests in the wrong places could replace lighter and brighter grasslands and shrublands, even snow, with darker trees. And finally, just as forests inspire the public, they can also cause resentment and disrupt local economies if they aren't welcome. People use land for other things, and it isn't just sitting there idle. So for our discussion today, I think we need to balance putting more carbon on land in our forests with extracting for wood products, increasing energy demands. We need to plan for climate change, planting genotypes that'll be better fit for future climates rather than today. We need to acknowledge that forests are getting younger. Disturbances such as droughts, insect outbreaks, fires in the western US at least, are becoming more common. And we may need to take forest biomass off of lands in places to make them and society more resilient. And finally, what we can do, in my opinion, is convince ourselves that natural solutions can be the primary tool in the fight against climate change. There is no substitute for emissions reductions in the energy sector.
Great, thank you. Let me move on to Anne. And, there are lots of ways that we can increase the stock of carbon in forests. Some of them involve slowing and stopping the deforestation that's currently occurring. Others include doing a better job of managing the forests we've already got. And a third category involves putting forests where we don't have forests, either restoring them or creating whole new forests. Can you help us put these different possible pathways for increasing forest carbon into context and some of the opportunities and limits that each provides?
Sure, Chris, and hello to everyone out there. Interesting way to be having our panel session today, so glad we're able to put this together for you. I think, Chris, you raise a lot of really important tools that we can be thinking about as we consider the role of forests and how we could be approaching forest management in general, including retaining old growth forests. The point about deforestation, which is of course so concerning, is it tends to be a permanent transition from forest to non-forest use. Could be agriculture, could be urban development, could be mining, but it's very difficult to move it back into a forest condition. So you really, the loss of forest to different kinds of development activities and uses at about 0.2% a year is a very significant amount, and one that we need to address. But we also have opportunities to take the forests that we currently have, which really cover a great deal of the earth, and manage them for multiple benefits, including a carbon gain. In some places where, in fact, I've spent a lot of my time in the eastern forests, we high-graded them at the turn of the 19th century for various industrial uses, and they still are looking, they have not achieved their full carbon potential. To be able to do greater forest management, to move them along the curve, to accumulate more carbon, to grow bigger, to thin, so that you have healthy growing forests, to reduce insects and diseases, that takes our forest estate that we have and manage it into a goal that actually can achieve, I think, greater opportunities, not only, as I said, in carbon sequestration, but also the benefits of water and biodiversity and public quality of life. And then there's the whole notion of afforestation, where we have had degraded lands, we've had conversion and not had significant resources to put back into forests, to be able to target some of those lands where they could go to a forested structure rather than to just lying fallow or not being able to support any kind of vegetation or minimal vegetation. There's some real great gains that we could do there. I spent a lot of my time in my early career on surface mines and the whole area of regeneration of those surface mines. A lot of them have gone to grasses and volunteers. Being able to be deliberately putting in healthy trees that can actually then contribute to carbon sequestration is an opportunity, and one that we could be thinking about. And then we also have the purpose-grown trees. We have a long history of plantation forestry in the Southeast. I think we're on our 5th or 6th rotation now, and the opportunity to take the knowledge we've gained through almost a couple centuries now of quality silviculture and turn that into productive forest land is a thing that we know how to do and we could really be promoting. So all of those pieces, I think, contribute to our consideration of where you can get the greatest gain in terms of forests and carbon. And then I also have to mention urban forests. While they are a small percentage, they actually can contribute to our consideration of carbon gain, but also energy and air pollution management in urban areas that really attribute to and contribute to other qualities of life. So to me, that's the full spectrum that we ought to be looking at.
And a really important point you raise is that many of these interventions in order to increase carbon forest actually involve using the forest for local people or even for international commerce. Dan, you've been a major advocate for reducing deforestation, partly because it has many of the multiple benefits that Rob and Ann have already described, but also it has profound benefits for climate. And there are some examples where investments in reducing deforestation have been a major success, probably contributing the largest impact so far in decreasing emissions, but others where we've really struggled. And I wonder if you can describe the landscape of the opportunities and challenges in preventing deforestation.
Hi, thanks, Chris, and thanks to you and the Woods Institute for organizing this session. I think it's really timely, and I'm glad we could do it remotely. But in a nutshell, we're coming off of an amazing decade where there's been more money, more attention, more corporate commitments and governmental commitments to the issue of deforestation in the tropics than ever before. And yet the results are a little bit worrisome. Some of the highest deforestation rates were in recent years. But there have been some spectacular successes too, and I think that's a source of inspiration and a source of some really important lessons. Brazil, for example, went from 20,000 square kilometers to less than 4,000 square kilometers beginning in 2005, and that rate has been creeping up ever since, unfortunately, about half as much as the historical average last year. They did it through a lot of command and control measures, expanding the area of parks, cutting farmers off from credit in high deforestation regions, enforcing the law. And Brazil's contribution of almost 7 billion tons of emissions of CO2 avoided hasn't really been compensated the way they were expecting it. About 4% of those emissions reductions have been compensated. And for me, that's one of the real challenges facing other tropical forest regions as well. That is the huge effort it takes to control these tropical forest frontiers and to forgo some economic opportunities that are more short-term worth the effort? Will the world recognize that and compensate that at some level? And in this sense, I think we have a great opportunity because of the climate neutral movement. More and more companies are committed to climate neutrality, and that's creating a new market really for emissions reductions. If we can channel that market interest and growth in the proper way, I think we'll see deforestation start to decline in Indonesia, in Peru, and some of the other leading nations at scale. And so we have a real exciting, I think, time to look forward in the next few years.
Dan, could you comment really briefly on the relative importance so far of government investments versus corporate investments in decreasing tropical deforestation?
There's a very vigorous, I call it zero deforestation movement, where about 500 companies have committed to remove deforestation for their supply chains. That is reinforced, I think, what governments are doing through public policies. The massive Brazilian strategy that I mentioned, for example, was reinforced by things like the soy moratorium that had a lot of corporate engagement. Part of the challenge, though, I think, is to come up with metrics that bring those worlds together. A lot of tropical forest governments can't really endorse a zero deforestation agenda because they also have to worry about expanding agriculture, food security, allowing more traditional landholders to continue their slash and burn until other alternatives are found. So we have a lot of corporate and government engagement that could be harmonized more effectively.
Great. So let me turn now to Rebecca to kind of take the little NGO perspective on all of this, several of the big environmental NGOs have really made natural climate solutions a centerpiece in their climate response portfolio, for a lot of the reasons that we've already heard, the co-benefits in terms of biodiversity and watersheds and habitat protection. I wonder if you can comment in sort of the big picture trends about the way that these natural climate solutions bring a mix of profound advantages, but also some risks from the NGO perspective and from your personal perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and thank you to the Woods Institute for holding this forum today. And also, and thank you for giving us all a little bit of a distraction from our daily lives right now during this time. I want to say that the NGO world, when we're thinking about the conservation world in particular, really focusing on climate change as critical to get under control, because so much of the impacts are felt so fast and furiously in the natural world. So if you care about nature, you care about the environment, you care about climate change because of its impacts. One of the things that the conservation community really woke up to a few years ago was the fact that the natural world has both sources of emissions and sinks. And so it's not just enough to look at the land sector and see that it is a source of 1.5 billion tons a year, but that's a mix of sources from deforestation and sinks from growing forests again, and from recuperating soils, and from making sure that we have a healthy and robust and species diverse forests. And so we asked the question, why, if it's 30% of all the sink of today's emissions, why is only 2% of the funding going towards this solution, particularly since it has so many of those co-benefits for people, like maintaining the water cycle, like filtration of water, like maintenance of biodiversity on the planet. And so we all really started digging in deep to this and said, and really thought about, is there a way we could look at our role in protecting the climate by mitigating, but also building more resilience in the response to climate? And that's when natural climate solutions were really born. One of the things that we have been focused on is trying to really understand, amidst all the numbers floating around, exactly how much of the solution can natural climate solutions be. And the interesting thing about this is that how much of the solution really depends on what your frame is. What are you trying to solve for? Are you trying to solve for climate? Are you trying to solve for the ecosystem services that forests provide, and the resilience and adaptation that some of these natural climate solutions can provide? Or are you trying to solve for both? And the question is, if you're trying to solve for both, you need to step back and take a entire century frame of the entire world. So we live in one planet, one whole planet. And one of the things that some of the claims have been made recently is that natural climate solutions can be up to 37% of the solution to a 1.5 degree planet. The problem is that doesn't take a whole century and a whole globe perspective. And we can see that if we don't take care of our climate, we can easily lose our natural climate solutions, as we saw with the Australian fires and the forests that burn and the carbon that was lost, and the lives and the wildlife that was lost during that time. So one of the things we really need to look at is the end of the century, we have about a 600 billion ton carbon budget we have to stick within. And it's really important how we parse the mitigation for that 600 billion ton budget between natural climate solutions and fossil fuel emissions reductions as well. Fossil fuel emissions reductions are around 76% of the emissions, whereas the land sector, including forests, is around 24%. So if we look at it that way, we want to be able to make sure that we have a whole climate, a 1.5 degree climate at the end of the century. And we want to be able to make sure that we are able to keep the natural climate solutions that we implement now intact by the end of the century, so they continue to provide all those benefits. That means we as a society need to attack both fossil fuel emissions reductions mightily in the next 10 years and implementation of natural climate solutions mightily in the next 10 years. So it's not one or the other. In the next 10 years, it's all about the race against the clock to hit net zero this half of the century. And then so we can create an environment where we can have forests, where those forests can deliver their benefits and can help us adapt to climate change and continue to provide those benefits to people around the globe, both in local communities and in cities.
Thanks. Yeah, my participant counter indicates that we're now over 340 people on this webinar, which is way more people than we've had at any of the live events we've done. It's way more friends than I have, or even my mother has. So I think that it's clear that this is an important topic, and I want to thank everyone for joining and apologize in advance if we're not able to get to all of the questions that have been raised. Rob, a theme that's come up in almost everybody's remarks is that we're not looking at an either-or world where we decarbonize energy and industry or concentrate on natural climate solutions. I wonder how you think about fitting the two pieces together. Should there be a phasing? Should there be simultaneous investments? How do we think about the natural climate solutions opportunity in the context of the big picture?
Well, I think we can't do everything at the same time, but I don't think we have the luxury really of thinking about phasing in one over the other. We basically need everything, like Rebecca mentioned. I mean, we need every arrow in our quiver, and we need to start, even faster to decarbonize the energy sector, and we need to continue to increase the progress we're making on forest land. So I think it can't be an either or. It has to be both at the same time. Mm-hmm. And the net losses from our forests and lands are 10 to 20% of the total global fossil fuel emissions. So they're a substantial portion. And I think that the beauty for me of sort of the forestry and natural working land solutions is that done well, we have the opportunities for tremendous co-benefits. And mm-hmm. I'm concerned sometimes when we think about managing lands with kind of carbon blinders on, sort of the notion of kind of getting a spreadsheet out and stuffing as much carbon as we can around the world. We've got a sustainable development goal perspective here. We want to look for opportunities where we can protect and restore our forests, enhance biodiversity, improve water quality, cut erosion. So I think it's an immediate need right now, and we need both emissions reductions and more investment. And I agree with Rebecca's comment, more investment in protecting lands.
Dan, one of the things that is really striking about the tropical deforestation issue is that once the forests are gone, they're gone, and it's not at all clear that they even could be restored. How do you think about the relative priority that we should be placing on investing, decreasing deforestation versus improving management versus afforestation where it's possible?
Yeah, I think Brazil has certainly demonstrated what no one thought was possible, which is to radically slow deforestation over a massive subcontinental forest. And I think that is one of the big levers we can pull at the time scale that we need to reduce emissions. And the question is getting the policy makers aligned with the markets and the civil society organizations. I would push back a little on the idea that once a forest is gone in the tropics, it's gone forever. Today there's about 12 million hectares of secondary forest in the Amazon region that, if they were protected from fire or grazing, they would come back, soaking up 10 to 15 tons of CO2 a year. There are mostly on private lands. A small incentive for those farmers to keep those marginal lands protected to restore forests could go a long way. Within about a decade, those forests are reestablishing the hydrological function of forests, which in the Amazon is so critical. And I think the most expensive piece of this whole thing is to do nursery-grown seedlings of several species, plant them out, protect them from herbivores and drought and what have you, and keep that going for enough years that you actually get a forest. That's the most expensive option we have. And so I think we need to pluck these low-hanging fruits, slow deforestation wherever we can, encourage natural regeneration so that Mother Nature does the heavy lifting, and then restore where we absolutely must.
So just building on this idea of the portfolio of options, and a lot of your work has been on how we can do a better job of managing working forests, including forests that we're harvesting timber products from or harvesting energy from. And I wonder if there are ways we should be thinking about managing the forest estate, managing working forests in ways that continues to provide the assets that we've gotten traditionally, while at the same time putting more emphasis on carbon stocks. Well, what should we be doing differently?
Great, great point. Yeah, I'm sitting here as I heard Dan's comment, thinking about the 11 million private non-industrial landowners who have forests in the United States, and how can we incentivize them to actually contribute to a carbon economy? Part of it is, of course, being able to get a dollar value of the products that are associated with that land. That could be carbon benefits, but it could also be growing trees, extending the rotation, getting larger volume out for wood product. It could be forest bioenergy. So being able to develop a plan with the individual landowner in mind that really optimizes the return on their investment, and that they also then get credit for the other values that have been mentioned by the other panelists. That's water quality, that's wildlife habitat, that could be recreation use. The good news in my mind is that we have the science behind silvicultural practices that can get us there. We have systems in place for forest certification to ensure that we in fact are achieving the goals that we are stated. And there are ways to do third-party verification for that. And that's systematized and is well recognized. And we have a suite of forest products that are continuously being developed that enable us to take some of the low value wood and turn it into a product where there's added value. And so from the standpoint of the private landowners, just an incredible set of opportunities out there. A lot of them don't have management plans, so this is part of the challenge that we have to work with them to actually help develop a plan that enables them to get all these benefits. We may want to come back to it later, but I also have to contrast that with what we're dealing with on public lands, where we have a lot of challenges with wildfire, insects, diseases, inability to do the restoration of the forest reforestation that's needed because of reduced resources. Again, what the one solution might be, if we had a use for that low value wood that we've talked about for thinnings, for improving the stands, if that can go to a product that gets some value that might pay for itself, then you have this opportunity to use market forces to really, I think, address not only forest productivity, but also the role of carbon. So all these pieces have to come together. I guess I'm an optimist that believes we have the science and the tools to be able to do that. We need the will to put it all together.
Let me run with this issue of monetizing the value of forest products, including carbon storage, and ask, let me maybe start with Dan about how important it is that there be a price for the carbon storage, and how we deal with issues like leakage, whether or not protecting a forest someplace just increases the incentive to cut down a forest someplace else.
Yeah, great question. And I think that's one of the forks in the road we're at right now, where we've got a growing demand for forest carbon offsets. You know, here in San Francisco, there's, you know, more than 100 companies that have made climate neutral commitments in the last year alone. And will all of that go to projects, or will it go to jurisdictional approaches, entire states, provinces, or nations that are reducing emissions? it's that latter option that, in my view, is where you really tie into public policies, where you solve things like a leakage and permanence, where you're engaging all of the stakeholders at the table. So indigenous people, smallholders, more industrial producers are all feeling the benefits of a program. It's really a development model. So I think that's a critical thing that we're facing right now. Will this tsunami of money that's looking for offsets be fragmented into projects, which have their role, but tend to be higher transaction costs and not so good at dealing with leakage? Or will they go to regional jurisdictional programs that are, in my opinion, far more robust?
A lot of the question there then becomes, are these forest carbon sinks substantially cheaper than decarbonization of energy and industry? And is there an opportunity there? And is there a risk? And Rebecca, I wonder if you want to speak to the way you see the utilization of financial incentives.
Yeah, thanks. It is really important that we recognize always that not just the carbon mitigation benefits of forests and natural lands, but also all the other benefits as well. And when we focus just on carbon alone, you can get some really perverse outcomes. But then if you, and perverse outcomes for the full suite of value you want from the natural systems. But when we think about the cost of those, there are some no-brainers that we can really focus on right away. So if you're talking about a trillion trees kind of program, which is a really nice moniker for avoiding deforestation, protecting forests, managing forests for better value, and restoring forests. I think that it's in that order that we should be thinking about implementing as well, particularly when we're thinking about a whole climate and a whole planet. Avoided deforestation and protecting forests done the right way in the right places is the least cost and gets you quite a bit of carbon and gets you right away. And that's because you're reducing emissions immediately. That's a really great way to start in the next few years, more focused on that. It also provides, intact natural forests also provide a full array of benefits, not the least of which is the protection of biodiversity and immense biodiversity. The next steps in managing forests seems like a no-brainer too, and is a little bit more expensive, but not as much expensive, and could create, as Anne was saying, lots of value in the short term, regenerating and managing existing forests or managed forests for more carbon and more benefit overall. And the last one is, I also want to mention regeneration of forests that have been deforested but are coming back. As Dan said, let nature do the work, and let's make sure Mother Nature can do the work. The last one is restoring forests, or restoration of forests. It is by far the most expensive and by far has many more barriers. One of the things we need to be doing in the next decade is making sure that we have online the information for how best to restore forests, where to restore them, with what kinds of ways should we restore them, with what kinds of plants, in what areas, and with what community stewardship, so that they can maintain their value over time. So that when we get to that highest cost intervention, we have done everything we can to decrease the cost so that we can implement it on the back end of avoided deforestation, protecting forests, and managing forests better. So I see these as very linked interventions that need to come online in different kinds of ways over the next decade to ensure that we hit zero emissions by mid-decade, and so we have a whole planet and a whole Earth at the end of the decade. And that's how I really think about the implementation of these, given the costs and given the barriers.
At the end of the century. I think I love your
end of the century. I'm so sorry. End of the century, yeah. I was sorry about
that. Let's talk a little more about the issue of restoration and the way the broad conversation has shifted recently from amounts of carbon or amounts of area to the number of trees. And the idea of 1 trillion trees has certainly been central to the many different dialogues. And it has profound implications, not only for the way we think about the problem, but for what we might actually do. Rob, do you want to say a few things about how 1 trillion trees fits into how much land we have available, and how to think about the distribution of emphasis between creating new forests and taking care of the forests we've already got?
Yeah, I think that's a question that any of the panelists and audience members would have good thoughts on. And I think one of the things I think a lot about is the difference between doing things at a sort of a project scale and doing things at the billion-ton scale and even the billion-acre scale. Because it's really the hundreds of millions of acres and the billion-acre scale that we need to think about if we're going to view these solutions in the same context, kind of at the same level of magnitude as emissions reductions. And so we're talking about a lot of land, and fortunately there are opportunities for a lot of land use. I think there are good studies. Jonathan Sanderman's studies about soils, a couple 100 million tons of carbon dioxide potential for soil restoration. It's not easy to get carbon into soil, but there are ways that we can do it. And if you can get it there, it tends to stay there and do lots of other good things for us. The potential for restoring degraded lands, in my view, is the best way that we could engage the trillion tree community, short of keeping the forests intact that we have, like we've already heard about. The trillion trees is a great moniker. It's catchy, it's sexy, and it's easier to plant 1 trillion trees than it is to grow 1 trillion trees. And we haven't really talked much about how you keep those trees alive. Half of them almost certainly will die. You look at the largest forestry project across the world, and that's China's 3-4 shelter program, 3,000 miles long, and they have successes there, and they have, frankly, things that have not worked well at all. So, I view the potential for degraded lands as the best opportunity for this. And then at some point in this call, let's talk about biomass energy and negative emissions and things like that, because that'll be a bit of a contrasting demand with restoring forests and keeping biomass in place.
Yeah, one of the things I think it's important for everybody to recognize is that when there are discussions about the consequences of 1 trillion trees, that means 1 trillion fully grown trees, which not only means that you probably have to plant way more than that, but you need to take care of them for a century or even more. And that's in the context of a changing climate, in the context of risk of wildfire and disease, and in the context of other pressures on land use. So there's a very wide river to cross between the idea of planting 1 trillion trees and having the full carbon consequences of that. I want to turn to the to questions from the rest of the participants after just one more quick round. And I wonder, Anne, if you want to comment on the point that Rob just made about utilization of forests for forest products and energy and the trade-offs that occur between that and using forests for carbon storage.
And yes, I would, and I'd actually like to add one more bit to it before I do that. And as we talk about the planting to the managing, there's an important step that we keep forgetting, and that's where are those seedlings going to come from? Natural regeneration will only take us so far. In fact, many of our degraded lands have no trees to provide seed to actually do the regeneration. So the opportunity to rebuild our nursery stock, to really get the diversity of tree seedlings that we need to better place them where they can survive. There's a whole bunch of work that needs to be done there. And sadly, our nursery production has really gone down over the last several decades. So as we take this holistic approach from the idea, the notion of planting, but where it comes from, what kind of seeds are we going to use, what kind of species are we going to use, and how do we optimize the selection of species, not only for the carbon sequestration potential, but also the changes that are happening in the ecosystem at that site specificity, and where things might have grown before, they may not be growing in the future. So how do we think through that? But as you go into the management part, there are clearly opportunities for products that add storage, to the carbon storage to the part of the equation we're looking at. The half-life for wood and homes, I think, is 80 years. So if you think about that, that's a way to hold carbon for a much longer period of time as other activities are taking place. The growth of mass timber buildings, for those who don't know about them, these are the really tall wood buildings that are being enabled because we have cross-laminated timber that's being created, improved strength, tensile properties, really amazing product. Well, that's being used and can be used using low-value wood and wood that might not go into other products. So we're taking advantage of not only a marginal wood material, but also putting it into something that can last a whole lot longer. And that's all the way through the traditional forest products, where we can continue to have productive forests using them, and also being able to, as we manage the forest, making sure that we're doing it in such a way that the trees that are left on site actually continue to grow and continue to sequester carbon. So there's again, going back to some of my earlier points, we know how to do this, but it's really being able to take that entire landscape perspective from the growth to the production, and how do you manage that? That is where our challenge is right now. And I think the opportunity to create more products from these activities will actually be a very positive incentive for a lot of landowners.
Dan, Rebecca, do you want to weigh in on this question of how to think about the joint operation of forest utilization and forest protection?
I think globally we have a challenge of, looking at the food demand over the next couple of decades. That will be in direct competition for a finite land area, and I think we really need to be extremely pragmatic, and we need to basically get the most value out of the land for carbon, for wildlife and biodiversity, recognizing indigenous claims and indigenous territories. There is space for industrial monoculture. I don't know if anyone who's seen a clonal eucalyptus operation that can soak up or grow 80 metric tons of wood a year. That has a place to play. We should not count that as natural forest, of course. So I think we're moving into a period where pragmatism, optimization of landscape function, and something like palm oil. There's a lot of resistance to palm oil today, and yet it is the most productive, at scale at least, supplier of biodiesel and of oil. It also has a lot of benefits for smallholders. A lot of smallholders we talk to, they like having a small grove of palm oil because it's a monthly income. So I think some of the more extreme views, we have to come together and have a pragmatic approach to optimizing entire landscapes and looking at the appropriate uses of the land.
Emphasizing that this really is about protecting livelihoods as well as protecting ecosystems.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think the idea that there's open land, all land is contested at some level, and there's an opportunity cost, a lost use if you go to trees. And so we need to find that balance and find the right incentives to make it happen. Sorry, Rebecca, go ahead.
Oh, no, thank you. And I do want to say that if you back up from the different uses of forests, I want to just talk really quickly about the trillion trees, because the motivation behind the trillion trees, there's 2 trillion trees initiatives. One's 1T.org out of the World Economic Forum, which is really a platform. WWF has a Trillion Trees initiative, which is about avoided deforestation, forest protection, regeneration, and restoration. That the motivation is really to say, how can we contribute in a significant way in the many, many uses of trees? And the tree is the magnificent thing about the trillion trees. It's such a good concept. It just captures your imaginations. What would a trillion trees look like? And what meaning would that be? And it was all motivated by a UN effort to plant 1 billion trees. But when the global assessment was done about that, or the global study was done, that's not that many trees. So let's do it at a scale. Let's do trees at a scale that is going to deliver something big for the planet. And there's controversy around it because you can't just focus on a single outcome. As Dan is saying, there are lots of things that are going to have to happen across the landscape to deliver a whole planet and a whole climate. And it's really important to think about the right trees in the right place for the right purpose to meet the needs of the community and the globe, and making sure we're keeping those in mind. And I think about the exciting thing about Trillion Trees is it gives urban folks a role to play in the solution, because if you plant trees in urban areas, it is really good for decreasing the urban heat island effect. Well, that's a part of the solution as well. And so I would just say, is when a Trillion Trees, move away from the controversy, understand that it really is a whole multiple batch of uses for trees, and that it's the right trees in the right place with the right purpose to deliver a whole planet. And we need to be thinking about that nothing's a silver bullet. And we really do have a lot of choices to make moving forward. And it's important that we really move quickly to do that.
Including the idea that an appropriate emphasis on natural climate solutions can be a way to enhance environmental justice and equity at the same time it builds climate solutions.
Exactly.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I'm going to start going to some of the many questions that have been written into the system by participants. And again, apologies if I don't get to everybody's. I'm going to start with a question from Dan Miller. It says, given that climate change will advance and that will lead to trees dying on a massive scale from heat, drought, flood, bark beetles, disease, etc., and this will happen at the worst possible time, how can trees be considered a carbon sequestration option? Rob, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I mean, it is a concern about permanence. How can we guarantee and increase the likelihood that forests that we plant today or that are growing today will be here in 50 and 100 years the way we need them to be for these solutions? I don't think it's an either or situation. I mean, there are clearly cases around the world where fire is increasing. Western North America is a really strong example, and there are reasons to think that, especially in places in the Western U.S. where we have a lot of older forests that haven't been harvested in a long time. So there are vulnerabilities in our forests, but I don't think that changes the opportunities for forest solutions and forest protection and restoration. I mean, we can, in spite of that mosaic of increasing disturbances, we can still grow forests more intelligently. We can extend rotation times for privately held lands. There are lots of things that we can do to lessen the risk of those kinds of natural disasters and stresses on our forests. So I guess I don't see it as an either or situation, but I fully acknowledge the question. Our lands, our forests are under stress now because of droughts and fires and climate change in general and human activities. So it's a tough needle, to thread.
But it also puts a lot of emphasis on the importance of acting soon so that the amount of climate change that forests are subjected to is as small as possible.
Yeah, and really thinking about what we plant. I like that point that Anne made a lot. It's, where we're managing forests, planting forests, we really need to be thoughtful about, the temperature thresholds those seedlings will be living in or experience to and for 50 and 100 years from now, and pick those kinds of individuals to grow.
I might just add in there, Chris. One example I think of this is the Amazon tipping point. A lot of attention on the Amazon fires last year, and should we look at these as sort of, the forests are going to burn anyway, so why are they a prominent solution, or piece of the climate solution? Versus, well, let's manage to reduce that risk, and I think their tree planting could take on a phenomenally important role. Mm-hmm. In reducing the risk of an Amazon tipping point where 10, 20, 30 gigatons of CO2 could go into the atmosphere through forest fire alone. But one of the best insurance policies for that is to allow natural regeneration to take place, slow deforestation to protect the rainfall system, since the rainfall system in that region is so dependent upon forests. And so I think, I guess my simple response is, well, if trees are vulnerable, if forests are vulnerable, let's manage to reduce that risk. And that is part of this overall agenda. Thanks.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, I've been involved in trying to develop targets for species for the Convention on Biological Diversity goals. And one of the points that's made in that community is we do have extinction rates right now that are 100 to 1,000 times greater than background rates, as they would be without human interference. And there's a really nice paper that came out last year that talked about those extinction rates. Those elevated extinction rates could be 2 to 4 times higher had there not been significant conservation interventions in the last 30 years with the onset of the Rio conventions, including the Convention on Biological Diversity and all the other activity happening around the globe. And so I think it's not as if you don't make concerted effort right now because there is a threat. It's that everything we do right now helps the learning of how to do it well so that we're on the road to creating a more sustainable planet. And so even if there is a risk of a forest fire, like we've seen in Amazon or in California, we still need to be working to maintain function in these ecosystems because we depend on them. And the baseline doesn't stay steady. It moves with that. And so the baseline could be, we're opening up options for ourselves by engaging deeply both in fossil fuel emissions now, as well as investment in natural systems to store carbon and to produce these other ecosystem services that we find valuable.
Great. Let me switch to another question. This one is from Emilio Villanova. What are your thoughts on how to deal with the quite widespread notion that many stakeholders have about the 1 trillion trees being planted, about being essentially monocultures and less about mixed species and diverse systems? And do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think we've actually been having this conversation for a while during this panel that there are an array of different management activities that could be going on, ranging from maintaining the old growth and high conservation value forests for values and how do we protect them, all the way to the notion of plantation forests. I think that there certainly will be opportunities to have purpose-grown trees in certain areas where we have traditionally been doing plantation forestry, like we have in the Southeast. But actually, there are many areas where the current structure of those forests is actually has not achieved its full potential. They were harvested. We had actually massive deforestation up until 1935 in this country. We actually lost 60% of our forests. It's been growing back. It's about 40% of where it was originally. But many of those sites actually are scraggly. They really are, because the best trees were taken in the turn of that 19th century. They're actually could be really improved with the active management. So I think what we're really talking about is even the midst of planting 1 trillion trees, there are areas that can really benefit from a really ordered, picking the right tree in the right place to create a healthy forest for other values, even as we will have some plantation forestry where we can get a lot of tree in 10 years and we have the science to do that. So I think, again, all of us have said the same thing. It's the balance of all of those different systems that I think we're working towards.
Could I jump in for a minute, Chris, there?
Oh, go ahead. Rob.
Yeah, just I'll build on what Ann and others have said. I think it's a really important question, and it's we haven't talked about a carbon price. So how you would incentivize people to change what they're doing with their land, and also to think about the difference between how you might manage forests in the Western U.S. or other places in the world where the land is public, versus incentivizing forestry in the eastern half of the U.S. where almost all the forest land is private. So we really need a completely different set of tools to accomplish the Trillion Tree Initiative, depending on whether we're talking about public or private land. But I think the carbon price we should spend a little time on that as well. I mean, without a carbon price, it's really difficult to see how a lot of these initiatives would ever pay for themselves.
Mhm.
Let me go back to a question that's about on this topic. This one's from Diane Schrader. I come from the world of institutional investment. I believe it was the sovereign fund of Norway that pushed Brazil to manage fires that would face divestment. Whoops, the question just disappeared. Anyhow, the rest of the question was along the lines of where are the opportunities for big institutional investors to be involved in the agenda of protecting forest carbon stocks. And Dan, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm fascinated by really the balance between divestment and investment. In my view, many of the tropical forest regions of the world, especially in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but also Brazil. Brazil is number 126 on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business ranking. They're bad places to do business. They're very risky places, and I think we need to find the mechanisms of lowering those risks, and with de-risking finance, with blended finance arrangements, and I think that accompanied by the message that if it goes this direction, that development path in your tropical forest region, we're going to pull our money out and put it in this other tropical forest region. So I see divestment alone, I think can be positive, but it can also be dangerous if the message is we don't want to do business with you, so let the other investors come in that don't care about sustainability, for example. I think a similar argument can be made with sustainable sourcing. Let's make the requirements of sourcing doable, achievable, aligned with public policy. I keep going back to Brazil, but Brazil has, if you're an Amazon farmer in Brazil, you have to have 80% of your land in forest. That's amazing. I can't imagine farmers in America accepting something like that, for example. And that needs to be recognized, rewarded. That should be aligned and built into the sourcing requirements, and not come up with a separate definition. So I think in some, there's huge potential for both investment, divestment, and sustainable sourcing to shift the logic on the ground, but we have to get things aligned and saying the right things.
Yeah.
Getting back to what Rob said, there's a public land piece and there's a private land piece. I think on the private land, where you really have the greatest opportunity is to go to areas where there are degraded landscapes. I've already mentioned the strip mined areas in much of the eastern US and some parts of the West. To me, that's low hanging fruit. They're out there, they're already have had some treatment, but we really have not invested in them the way we could from a reforestation standpoint. And there are those who are very interested in that. There's actually the Appalachian Commission that not only is looking at the health of that particular region of the country, the Appalachians in general, the health, economic health, but also the human health and the opportunities for jobs. So the low-hanging fruit is where you have these incredibly degraded lands already. On the public lands, we have more land that needs reforestation than the federal government could possibly pay for. Speaking especially of the national forest, but there certainly are associated state lands. To be able to form partnerships with the federal government to actually more aggressively do reforestation, especially in critical watersheds where the added value we've talked about, you put the trees in, you're also getting source watershed protection, you're getting wildlife habitat, and you're getting a higher really a higher quality of landscape in the long run. So to me, those are the two where there's some immediate wins that could be made.
Okay, thanks. Let me go to another question. This one's from Paolo Trevisani. I heard from a highly productive, well-educated farmer. Why would I grow forest on land I can use to produce food for humanity? What would you respond? Rebecca, you want to start with that one?
Well, and that goes directly to the barriers that will be put in place or are in place, to massive tree planting or restoring or afforesting lands. That it's not just is it public land, is it private land? what are the options for tree planting in those cases. But even so, the culture not just in the U.S., not just in the U.S. where it might be a really good place to plant a forest or to regrow a forest in its entirety for its full array of benefits. If the culture and the community don't support it, it won't persist over time. And so we often talk about the limits of the climate to reforesting or to allow for forest regeneration. But those cultural barriers and cultural options tend to be as difficult as the climate itself. And so really thinking that farmer is just speaking from his heart. It's what he knows, what he loves, what he believes to be beautiful, what his friends are doing. And so the behavioral aspects of trying to address the kind of changes on the scales that a trillion tree planting would have to address are really important. One of the reasons why I really like the trillion trees idea, as long as it's implemented well, is it because it really goes to how to mobilize communities to steward their own action long into the future. If you could figure out that in the next decade, how to do that at scale and how to bring down the costs of avoided deforestation, of forest regeneration, forest protection, and forest restoration, if you have the kind of investment to bring down the costs, then you can begin to shift some of this. But without the investment, without the focus on communities and the behavioral shifts that need to take place, it really is going to be impossible. So I think we see in WWF working in 100 countries from around the world, it is very important for communities to be engaged and involved and embrace the outcomes you're trying to seek.
Just a quick intervention on this Brazilian farmer. I think what's really interesting to me is that the value to global society, let's take a hectare of forest on an Amazon farm, is going to be $50,000 or so of avoided economic damages of keeping that forest standing. What the farmer is dealing with, though, is a hectare of land that's worth $100 under forest in the land market versus $1,000.
Mm-hmm.
That's a much smaller delta than the 50,000. And the behavioral change we need is to narrow that gap between $100 and $1,000 to achieve that $50,000 value to global society. And so getting back to the pricing issue, I think it's not a big price question. I think the price per ton actually ends up being quite small, especially when added to some of the other cultural values that Rebecca was mentioning, to some of the other perceived local benefits in terms of extreme drought and amelioration. It's good to have forests near your crop fields and things like that. So it's not as far off as it seems, getting back to Paula's question. Thanks.
And
another approach to talk to this farmer is not in the context of transitioning from agriculture to forestry, but really to ask the question, how could you get some carbon sequestration benefits from your agricultural lands? What can you be doing with your practices, or how can we improve practices so that there is deep-rooted plants being put in, there's cover crops, there's carbon accumulation that takes place, there's different approaches that can be used, and maybe put in some woody plants along your stream so that you're actually reducing runoff and getting some water quality benefits. So it's not, I think we really get down the bad road if we start talking either or, but how do you use all lands to achieve some of the goals that we're trying to achieve?
And recognizing that some of the incentives that we're talking about to encourage people to do a better job of stewarding forests could also be used for encouraging people to do a better job of stewarding ag lands. Let me ask a question that all of you have spoken to, but in a way that seems a little bit indirect. And this idea of restoring degraded lands has been really central to the conversation so far today. I don't have a feel for how much land that is and what the carbon storage potential or the carbon storage rate on that land might be. What are the thoughts?
One way to look at this is really as the forest transition. Most national societies go through a period of forest depletion that's followed by reforestation or natural regeneration. In a way, we're trying to avoid the clearing of marginal lands And a lot of times they're marginal for agriculture, but not marginal for trees. They're rocky, they're sloping, they're poorly drained, and trees can do all right there. And so I think if we think of all of this as sort of building a bridge across the deep valley of the forest transition that forest economies go through, the opportunity is to really focus on keeping forests standing on marginal lands, and where they're gone, making sure that the means for natural regeneration are in place.
Other thoughts on this one? On the question of, is the big opportunity, well, clearly an opportunity is degraded lands. Is that the big opportunity? Is that where the win-wins come into the sharpest focus? Or is that part of the broad portfolio of natural climate solutions we should be taking as much advantage of as we can?
I guess for me, it's somewhere in the middle. The win-win opportunities for degraded lands, in my view, are the biggest. We can restore these lands. We can restore the lands with grasslands and other species. It doesn't just have to be trees, but these are the places where the soil has been lost, and where erosion has been in place, where organic matter has disappeared. And I think by using trees thoughtfully, there are a lot of degraded lands in the world, both in temperate systems and in the tropics. And by using them to grow trees, to stabilize the soils, to hold on to the water and nutrients that come into those systems, they are a big numerical opportunity and a big sort of inspirational opportunity to see lands recover and come back in a healthy state and provide biodiversity for us. So I guess that's why I view restoration as sort of parallel, critically important with forest protection.
Yeah, and Chris, I would add to that as we have more people on the planet and we're trying to use every inch of the earth and all the resources with higher efficiency, is that we can't have the waste we had in the past across any of our sectors. And the land sector is no exception. We'll need to bring those degraded lands back online to deliver, and do so in a way that's cost effective given the range of societal preferences and priorities. But I do think we really need to look and lean hard on the restoration, in the restoration sciences. There is an awful lot of literature about what the right kind of restoration in the right place with the right plants and so on, and just a wealth of information about what fails and what doesn't. And I actually think if we begin to focus on degraded lands, like Rob is suggesting we need to, it won't be one size fits all for restoring degraded lands. There will be a whole range of ways in which we interact with degraded lands to restore them, to revitalize them for different kinds of uses, depending on where they are and the people that they're serving. And so I do think there's that we're in a really interesting and really exciting time where the kinds of information that's been generated in restoration science is meeting the kinds of information that are flowing from big data technology and analysis. And we can get better at concentrating our focus on particular degraded lands for particular purposes. I'm not the expert on how many of those lands can be effectively restored, but that's a number I think that all of us should have in 1 year. We should all have at the tip of our tongues, because it's going to be that important in the future. So I'm going to leave here and look those numbers up and see if they exist.
Great. Let me ask another question. This one's from Jamie Irwin, and it speaks about California issues. Can anybody speak to how tree planting initiatives may need to be adapted to fit the needs of frequent fire forests, such as those in California, in areas where fire suppression has already led to unnatural levels of forest biomass and forests are no longer resilient to fires? How can we ensure carbon stability?
I can speak to that just a little bit in some practical experience that we've seen up in the Mount Shasta area, where Pacific Forest Trust and others have worked together to do forest management that includes removing certain species that become basically torches for flames, and leaving those that actually have some resilience. So I think that comes back to what kind of species and where, how do you position them on the landscape if you are doing regeneration, active planting, and be very mindful of the distribution of that. There clearly is still thinning that's needed to remove some of the density in our forests. And that has to be coupled at a landscape scale on where the right tree in the right place at the right time is actually a very sensible. But I think you have to be thinking about it, that species specific and geographic perspective.
So maybe if I could jump in, Chris, being based here in California, we, I think not everywhere we're going to be able to plant trees necessarily. I mean, there's a lot of pressure and evaluation being undertaken now to think about thinning and removing biomass in places, as I referred to, in part because of the danger of fires. And another really interesting thing about a state like California is I don't know what our exact size is, but we're about 100 million acres. I mean, we do 50,000 acres of controlled burns in California a year, and it's basically only in a few national parks and such. So, controlled burns and tools that people use in other states and around the world are essentially completely absent in California. And there are reasons for that: danger of fires, value to property. But we really need to think about those kinds of tools and managing more proactively if we're going to manage the risk of fires in states like this.
And finding a way to make the forest as fire resistant as possible at whatever level of carbon that entails is going to be an important factor, not only for public health, but also for the carbon balance. Okay, now I'm going to change topics completely. Brian Bartholomew says, I'd be curious to hear what the panelists think of mangroves and kelp as part of the mix.
Well, I'll just say that the oceans are a part of the full array of solutions for both the climate and for all the other ecosystem services that they provide. If you're talking about carbon mitigation or if you're talking about climate adaptation, they're going to be important and to the extent that they store carbon as mangroves, it might not be a silver bullet, but it is part of the many solutions that we need to bring to the table that also provide other benefits such as coastal protection, nurseries for fisheries, and other kinds of habitat and kelp as well. And so I do think we need to really pay attention where natural habitat provides the range of both carbon benefits, but also other benefits to deliver to local communities. So I think they're part of the solution, and it shouldn't be ignored just because at a global scale, they may not store as much carbon. Again, I think it's really important that we look to local communities, have national or international guardrails about the kind of One Earth we want in the future, and then look to communities and nations to really implement those in ways that are respectful of their needs, the full array of services that they need.
One of the things I love about the opportunity to protect and restore mangroves and kelp is that even though they don't constitute a very large area globally and are therefore limited in their total potential, they can be very high in local density of carbon storage, and it shows how you can have profound local scale benefits, both for carbon and for co-benefits, in a context that doesn't necessarily add up to a huge global number by itself, but it could be part of a rich portfolio that really makes a difference. Let's see. Had a question about the use of wood in building materials. Rob or Anne, would you like to comment on how you see wood in building materials as fitting into the overall carbon context?
I'm happy to start since I brought it up earlier. And certainly the data that we have shows that there is a carbon storage potential in buildings. The housing, I think I mentioned earlier, the figure is a half-life of 80 years in houses. In fact, that can be extended if you can repurpose the wood from a house, if you're doing a demolition or a restoration, any kind of a renovation, and move it into another product. And actually, they've done this in Baltimore, where they're now using heart pine from the 1900s in furniture. So it's gone not only 2 centuries, but now it's going to go longer because of the quality of the material. But this new emerging field of cross-laminated timber, the ability to put in tall wood buildings, these are going to be commercial structures. They're going to have a much longer life. They're taking, in most cases, the intent is to take low value wood, convert it into something that has structural properties that are superior to the regular 2x4s, and actually then enable carbon storage for much longer in buildings that have a lot of aesthetic value too, and have other quality of life aspects. So I think it definitely has to be part of the suite of considerations, and has to be brought in. The linkage between forest conservation products and markets really has to be included in our conversations.
And I agree with Ann. If we think of cement emissions being 3, 4, 5% of global fossil fuel emissions, it's not a huge number, but it's a substantive number. And wood in buildings, there's exciting engineering work being done, building skyscrapers. Wood, the residence time is long, as Ann already referred to, 50 to 100 years. So I think there are real opportunities as part of a portfolio. At the billion-ton scale, the bucket for buildings and such is pretty small, but we need everything that we have at our disposal to make a dent in the climate change problem.
We just have time for a couple more questions. Here's one from Alexander Ivanov. In Colombia today, at this moment, thousands of hectares of forests are being cut down. How can this catastrophe be stopped in the context of violence, poverty, illegal crops, etc.? Dan, help us put it in the context of the issues that are important in the developing world.
Yeah, and that's a great question. As you all know, Colombia is in a post-conflict era right now. Peace agreement a couple years ago is begging the question of what are the new economic alternatives that will replace coca and cocaine, and there are a lot of things that are happening to address those. Basically, rural communities, and there's a big shift back into the forest as those forests become more secure. But can cocoa, can a better form of cattle, silvopastoral systems, can coffee and rubber and other things that are prevalent commodities, can they be done in a way that's going to generate more income so that people can basically get by and see their livelihoods improve without always biting into the forest? The Department of Caquetá still has a lot of arms and a lot of paramilitary activity. This is a long-term development agenda that needs to take place. But sort of getting back to that divestment question, is Colombia and a place like Caquetá needs help now. They need investment for those economic opportunities to come around. And they need big companies to step up and say, we'll buy all of the milk and the cheese coming out of Caquetá, as Nestle is doing. And I really see, it as mostly an economic question right now, which I think in the context of the coronavirus too, there's going to be a lot of folks going back to the land when they lose their jobs in the city because of this pandemic. And that's going to create additional pressure on the land. And the question is, will the big investors and buyers see that, recognize that, and engage in these regions?
Well, we just have about 5 minutes left, and there are a whole bunch of questions that we didn't get to. But I also want to ask each of you on the panel whether there was a question you wanted to answer that I didn't ask. And what's a take-home message from all of this that you really want to leave people with as we draw this conversation to a close? Rebecca?
Yeah, I want to, we need all the hands on deck, and we need them at very large scales to reduce fossil fuel emissions. That is contributing to climate change, but also to enhance the benefits that people get from nature. It's really important that we increase our investment in nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions. First, starting with avoided deforestation, forest protection, and regeneration, and forest management, and then, of course, forest restoration. I see that this new campaign around 1 trillion trees as being critically important to that, because it engages not just the policy thinkers at the international level, but communities around the globe. You've seen a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of media attention to this. It's the kind of opportunity that those of us that work in this space look for. And as a natural scientist, I've had to shift my gaze from the problems with the original study to the opportunities that the attention that study has delivered for the kind of outcomes we're seeking. And so on the road to a whole planet, I see that we need to be trying everything we can in the next decade as furiously and as fast as we can, and make sure that we know by the end of the decade exactly what works in the natural climate solution arena, and that we're ready to implement at scales that matter. And I think it's going to take all of us, and I think that it's really important that we keep that in mind, that the movement now matters more than ever.
Excellent, thanks.
I guess my main message was we just come off a decade of building and solving a lot of problems. You know, for the tropical forest issue, we know how to do baselines, reference levels. We know how to do the monitoring, reporting, and verification. We know how to do safeguards to make sure that Indigenous people have a seat at the table and other traditional communities, and that's actually happening. Mm-hmm. I guess one of my concerns is that we move into the nature-based solutions space and try to reinvent the wheel when so many things have been done and are working. So I think we're not starting from scratch when we talk about planting a trillion trees. Let's draw on all of the structures and agreements that have been made. And, you know, I think we could see a lot of progress in a short amount of time. Finally, I'd say the forest piece of the climate change solutions is in a way the most difficult one because of the complexities that we discussed today. But I would argue it's also the most important one because there's so many other benefits that come out of it in addition to the climate benefit.
Yeah, first I'll respond to your first point, which is what's the answer to the question I didn't get. And it's really about reinforcing the value of soils and below ground processes. We don't really fully, we can describe the dimensions and the carbon of an above ground tree. We can't do consistently the same below ground. So we don't always know deep carbon versus shallow carbon. If we're going to be really doing a carbon balance, let's get better data around that below ground portion. And at the same time, let's look at the landscape scale. It's not forests alone. It's forests and ag lands and shrublands and grasslands, and looking at the entire natural ecosystem together. And I think there's a lot of commonalities around that. In terms of the take-home message, I feel like for 2 decades where we've been, hey, forests, remember, we're here. And now we're here. And there's just so much opportunity to ride this storyline around trillion trees and the value of forests as part of a carbon solution. We got to get it right. And we got to get it so that all of these components we've been talking about for the last hour are part of that solution and that planning that goes into it. So I'm very enthusiastic. We've got a little work ahead of us, but I also don't think it's unsolvable.
Thank you. And Rob?
I guess my take-home message is carbon management and protection through the lens of co-benefits, just to make sure that we think about water and air quality, people's preferences, and local cultures, soils, and all of the things that come together, biodiversity, that make healthy ecosystems more resilient and more enjoyable. So my priorities would be protecting forests where we have them. We've heard a lot about that. Restoring forests where we can regain some of these other benefits. Managing our working lands more efficiently, where there's tremendous opportunity. And then maybe finally making sure that we don't use a trillion trees, don't allow it to become a crutch or be seen as replacing fossil fuel emissions action, because we need that most of all.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I want to close just by thanking all of our webinar rockstar panelists, Rebecca, Ann, Rob, and Dan. I also want to thank all of you participants who joined. A really wonderful set of questions. I apologize again that we couldn't get to everybody's. And I also want to thank the great Woods staff, Lee and Natalie and Roberta and Molly, who made this possible, and Justin, who admirably managed the video interface. Let me just leave you with this thought. that there's no question that trees and forests are a critical part of the climate solution, but they're only a part, and we need to tackle the whole problem as we move forward. Thank everyone so much for joining today, and I wish you all well. Stay safe, and everybody's families stay safe as well. Thanks so much.